And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. At the start, everything seemed perfect. The new outfit that she had bought fitted like a glove and everyone said she looked stunning. The cake she had begged her stepmum to bake had come out brilliantly, and as promised, a friend had come up with the drugs to make her special day just that little bit more special. It was early in the evening of Saturday the 11th of November, and Leah Betts and her best friend Sarah Cargill were in her bedroom at her parents' house in Latchington, Essex, getting ready for her 18th birthday party. Originally, Leah's parents had planned to go out for the evening and leave the teenagers to it, but earlier that day they changed their minds and decided to keep an eye on things. As a former policeman, Paul Betts was addicted to order, and only too well aware of how easily such parties could get out of control. He wanted to be completely sure that the toilet didn't end up wrecked, the carpets weren't covered in sick, and that no one tried to sneak in any alcohol or drugs. Which was why, as Paul and his wife Janet prepared snacks for the party, Leah and Sarah were hidden away upstairs, each staring at a fingernail-sized white tablet embossed with an apple motif in the palms of their hands. Leah was no newcomer to drugs. Since leaving home to study at Basildon College, she'd experimented several times. She and Sarah had smoked dope, snorted speed, tripped out on LSD, and dropped E at least 4 times. But as Leah went to take her latest tablet, Sarah stopped her. The ecstasy they had bought before had been embossed with a Dove logo. Apples were reputed to be far stronger, and Sarah thought it might be best if they only took half a tablet. Leah thought for a moment, then popped the whole pill into her mouth. "We've done it before," she said. "Don't worry, we'll be fine." Within a few hours, Leah's other friends had arrived, and the party moved into full swing, her parents keeping their distance to spare their daughter's blushes. "Once everyone had arrived, we kept out of the way," says Paul. "But we thought we knew what was going on. The Wrinkleys were supposed to be banished to the kitchen for the evening, but I told Leah that I would have my one dance, and we did, to When a Man Loves a Woman." Paul went back to the kitchen, leaving a laughing, smiling Leah to blow out the candles on her birthday cake. Seconds later, Leah's younger brother William burst into the kitchen. "Leah's being sick in the toilet upstairs. She's calling for Mum." The scene that greeted Janet Betts was like something out of a horror movie. Leah was on the floor, throwing up violently and screaming that she had gone blind, that her head felt like it was going to explode. Leah turned round to Janet, and Janet saw her eyeballs were so bloated that they were literally bulging out of her head, and her pupils were enormous. I said, "Oh my God, what have you done?" And she said, "I've taken ecstasy." Then she started clawing at me, screaming, "Help me, Mum, help me, please help me." Those words will haunt me for the rest of my life. By then, Paul Betts was also in the bathroom and fell back on his instincts, switching into detective mode in a flash. "Where did you get it from? Who gave it to you?" he asked. Leah, in between spasms, gasped the name Stephen a couple of times, then collapsed and stopped breathing. Paul and Janet took it in turns to give her mouth to mouth, but by the time an ambulance had arrived, Leah was in a deep coma. Earlier that same afternoon, Craig Rolfe had made his way from Essex to Golders Green to meet Black Gary, one of North London's top drug dealers. Having picked up his share of Steele's cannabis, Rolfe was anxious to turn it into hard cash as quickly as possible, and Gary was the man for the job. The deal was as straightforward as could be. The price per kilo worked out to an even £10,000 for the lot, with Rolfe's personal profit coming in at around £6,000. It would have been more, but Steele, insisting that the risks were greater since his brush with customs, had pushed the price for his importation services up, something that had pissed off Tucker and particularly Tate no end. No money was changing hands between Rolfe and Black Gary that day. Instead, the cannabis was being laid on, and Gary would pass over the money as soon as he had sold the drugs. It meant that Rolfe would have to wait a little longer to get paid, but the drugs were out of his hands in one fell swoop, and he didn't have to run the risk of being done for possession. All he had to do now was sit back and wait. Elsewhere in Essex, Darren Nicholls was also waiting for the money to start rolling in. He had dozens of buyers waiting for the latest consignment of cannabis to arrive, and the 3 kilos he had taken from Steele, 1 as his wages and 2 more to satisfy demand among his regulars, had all gone in a couple of hours. Pleased with himself for having done a good day's work, Nicholls was preparing himself for a long, hard Saturday night down the pub, when the first phone call came. Darren Nicholls states, "I wasn't worried, just a bit pissed off. You always get someone who wants to try it on. They buy some puff on credit, have a few joints, then try to pull one over on you by saying it isn't any good and asking you to cut the price. You just have to be firm and aggressive. But this time was different. It wasn't just one or two calls. Everyone I'd sold it to was coming back and complaining. It wasn't like they were saying that the stuff wasn't as strong as they expected or that I'd sold them short. They were saying that the stuff was shit, complete unsmokable cack. A couple of them were going totally mad. They thought I was trying to have them over. They were screaming down the phone at me. 'What the fuck are you playing at? What is this stuff you've sold us? Because it's pure shit, it ain't puff. You're having a laugh, ain't you?' Darren Nicholls was not alone. A furious Black Gary had got on the phone to Craig Rolfe less than an hour after their meeting to tell him that he wouldn't be getting a penny as the cannabis was totally unsellable. Pat Tate, Tony Tucker and Peter Corey had also received complaints, and as with Nicholls, the situation was quickly getting out of hand. Darren Nicholls states, "I called up Mick and told him that Harris had ripped us off. It turned out that he'd been getting complaints all night long as well, but couldn't get hold of Harris. We arranged to meet in a pub near his house and he handed me a 5-kilo pack of drugs wrapped differently to the rest. He asked me to test them to see if they were any good. So I took them home and Sandra tried a bit and immediately felt sick. It was all rubbish, every last gram." Nicholls phoned Steele again and tried to break the news as gently as possible. He slowly explained that the biggest drug shipment Steele had been involved in since getting back into smuggling, the one he'd almost got caught bringing into the country by customs, had been a complete waste of time. Steele went ballistic. By Sunday afternoon, there had been no improvement in Leah Bett's condition. Paul and Janet, who had been at their daughter's bedside since she had been admitted, fought back the tears as doctors at the Broomfield Hospital in Chelmsford explained that the longer she stayed in the coma and failed to respond, the less chance there was that she would ever recover. It was then that Janet made the decision to have a photograph taken of Leah, eyes closed to the world with a horrific tangle of tubes erupting from her mouth and nose, and monitors plastered across her chest, as a warning to others who might be thinking of taking ecstasy. "You can tell them, but they don't listen," Paul said at a press conference shortly afterwards. "The message that I have for other parents is that you have only got to see my daughter. If you want to take drugs or sell them, look at her. Look at my pretty daughter lying there dying. She looks so peaceful. We just keep expecting her to wake up at any moment." The release of the picture was a marketing masterstroke. It transformed what would have been the latest in a line of tragic ecstasy-related deaths into the launchpad for a massive drugs awareness campaign. Virtually all of Monday's newspaper ran the photograph, most of the tabloids featuring it on their front pages with huge banner headlines. "Look what drugs do. The picture her parents want Britain to remember," said the Daily Mail. You simply couldn't move without being confronted by Leah Betts. Swarms of journalists had descended on Basildon asking questions about who ran the clubs, who sold the drugs, who the local villains were. The photograph was even featured on every TV news broadcast. The story was at the top of every radio bulletin, and soon the names of the members of the firm were at the top of every police agenda. Emotions were running particularly high, because in those first few days it was believed that Leah had been sold a contaminated pill. The race was on to find the men the tabloids had dubbed the evil dealers, who were peddling in death, before there were any more tragedies. It was one of those situations where the man in charge of the police investigation, Detective Chief Inspector Brian Story, needed to be seen to be doing something, and quickly. By Monday afternoon it was becoming increasingly obvious that Leah was not going to make it, and that her death would only provoke a greater outcry. Within hours of her being admitted to hospital, Story had established from Leah's friends that the tablet had been brought on the Friday evening from Raquel's nightclub after Louise Yexley, another friend of Leah, had failed to obtain any drugs herself. Stephen was either Stephen Smith or Steve Packham, both of whom were friendly with Louise and both of whom had been to Raquel's that night. One of the two was definitely responsible for buying the pills that later found their way to Leah's house. But with the allegations of poison tablets firmly in his mind, Story was also after the person ultimately responsible for supplying pills to the club. The name of Tony Tucker had come up repeatedly during police inquiries, and a quick background check soon revealed that he had been linked to a club drug death before. Some 18 months earlier, in March 1994, 20-year-old Kevin Jones died at Club UK in South London after taking ecstasy. In a bid to track the source, police put two of the club's suspected dealers under surveillance and discovered they had been paying Tony Tucker, the man responsible for security at the club, £1,000 per weekend for the exclusive rights to sell ecstasy and cocaine. Though the connection was clearly there, Story knew that Tucker was much too clever to have anything incriminating on his person or even back at his home in Fobbing. There was no point in arresting him. He wouldn't even begin to crack. Instead, Story needed to find another tactic. A weaker link in the chain, where if he applied enough pressure, the whole drugs ring behind the Leah tragedy would come tumbling down. Even before DCI Story had made his first move, Pat Tate was starting to feel the pinch. The business with the bad cannabis was really starting to hurt. Contacts that he had spent years nurturing were now thinking twice about dealing with him, just in case they too ended up with a duff load. In his twisted, drug-addled mind, there was only one possible explanation for the whole mess. Michael Steele, the man he had once considered a friend, and whom he had trusted with his money, was trying to rip him off. Tate was also worried by the fact he had passed on some of the duff puff to the brothers, the men who had lent him the money to get into the deal in the first place. They, not surprisingly, had been furious when the goods turned out to be unsellable, and they had sent some of their heavies round with orders to bring Tate before them so he could explain himself or face the consequences. As he stood before the impromptu kangaroo court, Tate explained that the bad cannabis had been entirely down to Michael Steele. In order to prove that he was telling the truth, he made the brothers a solemn promise. "I will bring Steele here, and I will make him get down on his knees and beg for forgiveness for trying to rip you off," Tate explained. "And then, when you've heard enough, I will put a gun to his head and blow his fucking brains out." The explanation was accepted, but it still left a small matter of the money that Tate owed. So far as the brothers were concerned, a deal was a deal. They had given him £40,000 and he had promised them £50,000 back. Tate promised he would get the money just as soon as he could. The brothers gave him 1 month. Even the most laid-back member of the firm was feeling distinctly uncomfortable. Normally, Tony Tucker was so distant from any actual drugs he sold in the clubs that it wouldn't have been a problem. But Raquel's was different. The main dealer there, Mark Murray, had suffered a string of police raids on his employees, losing more than 2,500 pills worth, more than £40,000 in just a few weeks. It meant that he hadn't been able to pay Tucker his usual rent and had gone into the red. A compromise was reached. Tucker would supply Murray with his ecstasy direct, with Murray buying the pills at twice the usual rate in order to make up the debt. Murray reluctantly agreed. He had long realised that it made good business sense to sell tablets that were as weak as possible. They cost the same, but it meant that the punters would buy 2 or 3 each during the course of an evening, and his profits would be far higher. Tucker's pills were much stronger, so strong that one would let you rave all night long. It would take forever for Murray to repay his debt, but Tucker was determined to get his money back, so he had no choice. The problem Tucker was facing was that everyone knew that his pills were the apples that Leah had taken, and that everyone was now talking about, and it was only a matter of time before the police found out too. Tucker was certain that he was going to be betrayed. Everyone around him became a potential grass, every knock on the door a potential raid. Tucker, very much the brains behind the organisation, was starting to let it all get to him. The paranoia was highly infectious. By the time Darren Nicholls arrived at Steele's house early on Monday evening, the master smuggler's mood had gone from bad to worse. Darren Nicholls states, "Mick was pacing up and down and showing me the pictures of this girl on the front of the local paper. He was really angry, stamping around, swearing, ranting and raving. He was saying, 'This is bang out of order. This is going to fuck things up for the rest of us.' Mick was particularly upset because of Leah's dad being an ex-copper. He was convinced that the bloke would put in all sorts of favours, and thanks to the wall-to-wall publicity the whole case was getting, make sure the gang behind the pills was caught. And as far as Mick was concerned, if one of them got done and the police started looking into their associates, then he'd be in the frame too." It wasn't like the police would have far to look either. Tate was on the phone to Steele virtually every night, complaining about the dodgy cannabis shipment and demanding his money back. Normally, Steele would have told him where to get off, that picking up a bad shipment is just one of those things and that he'd lost money on the deal too. But that would have only made Tate more angry, and he was desperate to get him out of his hair. The last thing he wanted was to be dragged into the Leah thing. Tate, in the meantime, was shooting his mouth off to anyone who would listen about how Steele had tried to stitch him up, and how he wasn't a man that anyone should ever cross. I think some of it was just bravado, to make him look good in front of Tucker and Rolfe, and some of it was just the drugs talking. I don't think Tate would have ever said any of it directly to Mick, but he did the next best thing. He told Sarah Saunders. Since she'd broken up with Pat, Mick had been spending more and more time with her and was helping her out in all sorts of ways. Mick thought of himself as something of a ladies' man, and I'd started to think the two of them might even be having an affair. Mick wasn't scared of what Pat was saying. He was just pissed off that he was going to mess up the operation. At the end of the day, Mick had a good, clean, neat little setup which no one knew anything about. It had gone completely unnoticed several times before they accidentally got spotted, but even then everyone had been released. But Pat was spoiling it because he was telling too many people. He thought the bit that we did was easy, when in fact it was the most difficult bit of all. Pat was always trying to set up other people to smuggle for him. A week or so before the bad shipment, he'd even had the cheek to bring some bloke who'd just got his pilot's licence round to Mick's house and insist that Mick tell him all about flying the drugs over the channel. But Mick wasn't worried about losing business as much as about Pat letting too many people know about how he operated. Pat thought he was out of reach, that everyone was scared of him, but he reckoned without Mick. As Steele and Nicholls chatted, Steele's mobile phone rang. It was Dopey Harris, who proceeded to explain there had been a terrible accident, that the wrong boxes had been put in the car. Harris insisted, however, that at least one of the boxes, around a third of the total drug consignment, had been good stuff. Steele told him in no uncertain terms that unless he got things sorted quickly, he was going to pass on Harris's address to Tate, Tucker and Rolfe, who would come over and sort it out in person. Harris quickly agreed that if Steele returned all the drugs, he would get all his money back. Steele passed a message on, and over the next few hours the cannabis started to filter back. Most of his customers were a little annoyed, but willing to forgive and forget, especially with the promise of a full refund. Tate, however, was still in a fit of temper about the whole affair, and massively frustrated about the Leah Betts thing. He smashed each and every slab with a hammer before delivering it back to Steele. He also held back some of the drugs, telling Steele he'd only return them when he had the money in his hand. It didn't take Steele long to work out that Tate was holding back roughly a third of the whole shipment, the same amount that Stone had insisted was good. There could be only one conclusion. Tate was trying to rip him off. You've been listening to Blogs 19, written by Tony Thompson. This book is available to purchase online at Amazon and other online book retailers. Many thanks for joining me for this video. Very shortly you'll be able to see some other videos from the channel, including the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos concerning this case in one convenient folder. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I look forward to seeing you all again in the next video. Take care. Cheers.